Hi, in this video lesson we're going to be talking about stems. Stems are one of the major organs in plants. Recall that an organ is a group of different tissues that work together for a common function. In the case of stems, there are three major functions. The first of which is support. So the stem is in charge of supporting the leaves and fruit, holding them up to the sun, holding them up to the pollinators, and so forth. The stem is also in charge of conducting materials between the roots and the leaves. So water has to go up, and sugar made in the plant has to go down. The stem is going to help the plant grow taller, which is primary growth, wider, which is secondary or lateral growth, and also help it grow new leaves and stems, which is axillary growth. Let's take a moment and review stem's functions. So when we discuss a plant, a lot of time we discuss a plant as being a tree or a bush or a shrub or grasses. What we're really trying to get across is what kind of stem it has. So when we talk about stems, there are two major classifications. The first one is herbaceous and the second one is woody. Now hopefully you all know what woody plants are. They have hard tissues that replace living tissues in plants. They also tend to have things like bark and so forth. A herbaceous plant isn't like that. A herbaceous plant usually has a green stem, and the stem, though functioning in support, also functions much more like a leaf. We find woody plants only grow in gymnosperms and dicots. Additionally, we can describe the types of stems by the layout of the vascular tissue. We won't focus on this much now because we'll talk about it more in class. The general stem anatomy has two major foci. The first one is looking at internal structures, where we can look at meristematic tissue, cork and pith, which we'll discuss, and vascular tissue, which will be the focus of this video. But we can also describe the external structures. So externally, we have a node, which is where the axillary buds, or in other words, leaves and branches, come off. We also have the apical bud, which is the terminal bud, or in other words, the top bud in charge of making the plant grow taller. In between the two, we have internodes. And finally, it's worthwhile mentioning that when a plant first starts to germinate, roots are created, as is the shoot. And the shoot is the stems and what will eventually also become the leaves. Let's take a moment and review the general anatomy. When we talk about stem anatomy, as we've talked about everything else, we've got four major types of tissue. Meristematic tissue is growing tissue, which we'll talk about at the end. We'll also talk about dermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue. Let's start with the ground tissue. Ground tissue includes two major parts. We have pith and cortex. So those two parts collectively have a number of functions. Some plants have ground tissue that helps store food. Some plants, especially those that are herbaceous, have ground tissue that help do photosynthesis. But almost all plants have ground tissue whose job is to help support the rest of the plant. The pith is also a support structure, but the pith tends to be the center of it, and in woody plants, it's typically dead xylem. In fact, sometimes the pith can be completely absent. It can be hollow, and the plant can still be entirely functioning. Let's take a minute and review the ground tissue in the stem. The dermal tissue in the stem could be one of two things. A herbaceous plant is going to have dermal tissue that resembles much of what we learned about when we talked about leaves. A single layer of cells that make up the epidermis, perhaps a waxy cuticle, maybe some hairy trichomes, and it's going to seem pretty much like a part of a leaf that is used for support. Woody plants, though, have very different stems because, of course, woody plants have wood and bark. So when we look at the dermal tissue of wood, bark is the most notable feature, and when you think of bark, you're probably thinking about cork. Cork is a type of cell that has very, very thick cells. When it's mature, it's focused at dead. That's why you can pick off the bark of some trees. Not that you should. We'll talk about why that's bad in a bit. So cork is dead when it's mature. Before dying, it secretes a waxy substance that helps protect the plant from invaders, from pathogens, from physical harm in general. The bark also has underneath the cork something called a periderm. Periderm is a multiple layer of epidermis. Remember, epidermis is usually a single layer. And in the cortex is where we would find the phloem. It's also where we would find new growing tissue called cambium. So the inside part of the plant, this part here, is mostly secondary xylem. In other words, mostly dead stuff. The living part of the stem, the most important part, is just underneath the cork. So it includes the cork, the bark. It includes a growing area called the cambium, and then phloem. Let's take a minute and review the dermal tissue. We will come back to the cambium and the bark in a few moments. Continuing with our discussion of tissues in the stem, we have vascular tissue. We won't focus too much on this because the vascular tissue is something we've already familiar with. Xylem transports water, phloem transports food. We'll talk about that when we get to physiology, how it actually accomplishes those. But typically, as we saw in the leaves and in the roots, that vascular tissue is arranged in bundles. One notable thing to point out is in the stem, phloem tends to be on the outside. In between the two layers is something called the vascular cambium. Remember, I mentioned that's for growth. We'll discuss that in a moment. And then xylem is on the inside. That layout is what we see in the roots and the leaves too, but this vascular cambium is a new thing for the stem. As we look at the general layout of vascular tissue, we see that bark is on the outside, that's dermal tissue. Then phloem and xylem are separated by that layer of vascular cambium. And then the dead xylem is in the middle. This arrangement with the vascular tissue on the outer layers is a little bit different than what we saw in the roots and leaves, where the vascular tissue tended to be in the innermost sections of the plant. The last type of tissue in a stem we'll discuss is meristems. Remember that meristems are cells that can grow new plant parts, and there's all the different types of meristems that we find in the plant. So dicots and gymnosperms are capable of secondary growth, or in other words, wider growth, making wood, because they have vascular cambium. Vascular cambium is a type of meristem that is in cylinders and surround the plant in a ring, just like the vascular tissue. It actually separates the xylem and the phloem. And it's from there that it makes new xylem and phloem, and it's the living vascular tissue. Okay. Also, the growth from the vascular tissue is what makes the rings. We'll discuss that in a moment. We also have cork cambium. That's meristem that makes new cork cells. The cork cells, remember, are important because they have those extra thick, tough cell walls that helps the bark have its protective properties. Let's review meristematic tissue in stems. Let's speak for a few more moments about the types of plant growth. So as I mentioned, stems grow taller. They grow taller from the apical meristem. The apical meristem is literally the top bud, sometimes called the apical bud or the terminal bud, that makes the plant grow taller. It also has a phenomenon known as apical dominance. Apical dominance basically says that the terminal bud can inhibit the growth of lateral buds. So by focusing on growing taller, we don't get too many of these side growths. Not all plants exhibit that, but there are some plants who exhibit very strong apical dominance and other plants that exhibit very weak apical dominance. As human beings, we can actually kind of control that by removing the apical bud. And when we remove the apical bud, what we see is instead of having a taller plant, we'll get a much thicker plant. Let's look at some examples. So in this plant we have the same species, but here the terminal bud has been left on. You'll notice that it's thinner but much, much taller. If the terminal bud has been removed, it will facilitate growth of the axillary buds, and it will make the plant much thicker. That's actually how we see some plants that could be a bush, or they could be a shrub, or could be a tree, all depending upon how they've been pruned, whether or not that apical meristem is exhibiting dominance. Here we see two different kinds of plants, a pine and a maple. Pine trees and conifers in general typically exhibit very strong apical dominance, which is how they get that cone shape, whereas deciduous trees that have that branching shape typically have much weaker apical dominance. A side note, as adults, when you guys are in charge of keeping, or even now some of you have landscaping jobs, when we prune a bush, we're pruning it so that we can remove we can remove the terminal buds and facilitate growth within more of those lateral buds, and that's going to make the plant thicker. Let's take a moment and review primary growth. Finally, let's discuss secondary growth. Secondary growth, remember, is only found in gymnosperms and dicots, so essentially woody plants. So, as we mentioned, there's two cambiums, two meristematic tissues. We've got a cambium as this dark kind of aqua shade here, and this also dark red shade. The vascular cambium makes new phloem, which is orange in this diagram, and new xylem, which is the greener of the aqua shades. And again, the cork cambium makes more cork. As the plant develops, it starts off herbaceous, but over time, as new layers of growth grow from the vascular cambium, and to a certain extent the cork cambium, but mostly the vascular cambium, it grows outward, creating a lot of xylem, and as it creates more and more xylem, it makes it thicker and thicker and thicker. The old xylem tends to die. We get then different layers of the plant. The heartwood is typically darker, and it's mostly dead cells. However, it's also mostly stronger cells. And its job is pretty much entirely support. The sapwood is the living tissue. It's towards the outside, and a couple of slides ago it was that pinky red shade, and it functions mostly in transport. As I mentioned, it's from the growth from the vascular cambium that we get rings in trees. So every year, the xylem starts to grow when conditions are right, which is typically in the spring. In the spring, there's usually a lot of water available, and the growth is fast, and so it tends to be lighter. And in the summer, the growth is slower, the cells tend to be smaller, and it tends to be a little bit darker. That creates the annual rings. One ring, then, is 1 year. So we can see how old a plant is simply by looking at its rings. We can also examine a plant's rings to tell us a little bit about the history. So we can see, for example, when some rings start to bunch, that maybe the plant was growing tilted to one side. We can see when there are scars, perhaps from a forest fire or from a drought. We can also see when there were years of more competition or struggles. So maybe an area here, like where the rings are closer together, maybe there was a lot of competition from other trees growing. As the rings thickened out, maybe those years the competition, those other plants weakened or were killed or harvested by people, and so perhaps there was less competition. And so by examining this difference, we can see a little bit about the tree's history and also the history of the environment. In this area here, where these rings are very close together, maybe that was a period of drought. We definitely know that there was a fire in this range of a plant. Let's review secondary growth. So, why do we care about this? Well, number one, you're in a botany class, so that's why we care. But number two, as you mature into adults and have to be responsible for potentially your own yard or landscaping, there are some things you need to know. And the first one is how we take care of trees. I mentioned already that pruning will make a tree grow thicker. Another thing we need to be cautious of when we care for our yards is girdling. So girdling is basically when we damage the outer bark. So a lot of times people think, oh, it's just bark, we can cut it down, we can chip our names in it, Joni Love Chachi or whatever. For willow trees, actually for birch trees, you can peel it off. But that's one of the worst things you can do. When you destroy the bark, you're destroying the living stem. And so consequently, when we girdle a tree, we can do severe damage to it. It should be pointed out that sometimes girdling is done to control a pest species or to try to save the tree when otherwise it might not be salvageable. But girdling is only done kind of as a last resort. Most of the time when we damage the bark, we are doing harm to the tree. We're preventing the flow of xylem and phloem and also breaking that down for future growth. So we see that we do lots of things in landscaping to protect that. So when we drive our mowers around it and so forth, we want to make sure that we're not whacking the trees with our weed whackers and so forth. So sometimes we'll go so far as putting some man-made protection. Other times we'll lay down some wood chips or just grow some plants around it, landscape around it to protect that sensitive bark, sensitive cambium that's just underneath the bark. Let's review one last time for secondary growth and stems in general. So that's it for our discussion on stems. As always, make sure you come see me if you have any questions.